Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Lincoln's Presidency, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the National Humanities Center and the Florida Virtual Schools Teaching American History Project. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm Vice President for Education Programs, and I'll be leading the seminar, I'll be moderating the seminar this morning. I'm delighted to see all of our friends from the Florida Virtual School back with us. I just want to remind you of a few things. You probably remember all about the National Humanities Center, so I'm not going to go through any kind of introduction, but I do want to tell you that in addition to these Florida Virtual School seminars, we offer a whole range of online seminars for teachers. You can go to our website and find our 2010-11 schedule. If you'd like to sign up for any of the seminars, I urge you to do so because they are selling out rather quickly. I also want to remind you of TeacherServe, our curriculum enrichment service that offers advice and information about how to teach religion in American history, the environment in American history, and African American literature and history. And I want to call your attention particularly to Freedom Story, that third instructional guide you see on your screen, because since we last had an online seminar, we have added a great deal of new material to that instructional guide. So if you teach African American literature and history, and particularly the Harlem Renaissance, you might want to check out some of the essays, the new essays in Freedom Story. In addition, I want to remind you about our Toolbox Library, our collection of primary resources organized thematically within chronological frames with extensive notes and interpretive questions that you can use in your classrooms. We'll soon be putting up a new toolbox for your use. Something brand new with the education programs here at the Humanities Center. We now have a Facebook page. We urge you to please become a fan of the Humanities Center's education programs. That way you will learn about all of our new seminars and any new material we put up on TeacherServe, and that way you'll be able to stay abreast of what's going on with us. Now, let me tell you about what's going to happen at the end of this seminar. You will be able to obtain a recording of the seminar, and you will have access to the PowerPoint through the website through which you obtained the readings for the seminar. In addition, on that website, you will find access to our evaluation, and we ask you please to fill those evaluations out. They are very important to us and to the organizers of the Teaching American History Project. Now, I did mention that the PowerPoint will be available to you. We urge you to plunder the PowerPoint as much as you want. It is there for your use. Take whatever you want from it and use it in your classrooms. That's why we put it up. Now, you will also receive from us documentation of participation. You recall we'll send you a letter certifying that you participated in the seminar, and you'll be able to present that to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Quickly, let me review how to participate. Some of you may be new to our seminars. If you want to speak up or ask a question, you can click on the hand-raised icon right there. I will see it, and at an appropriate juncture in the seminar, I will pass the microphone to you, and you can hold forth with your question or comment. Right now, all your microphone icons are red, which means that your microphone is turned off. When I pass the microphone to you, your microphone will turn green, and you'll be able to be heard by your colleagues. If you would rather chat, put your cursor in the chat box down here, type your message, hit the send button right there, and your chat message will appear in the large box above that. If the chat is scrolling by too quickly for you and it's distracting, you can click this little button right there, that arrow, that will collapse the chat panel. Don't worry about missing the chat because as the moderator, I'll be bringing it into the conversation as it's appropriate. Should you want to send a chat message, just click on that arrow again, and the chat box will open for you, and you'll be able to send a chat message. Are there any questions now before we begin? If everybody's ready to go, send me a smiley face. Let me know that you're ready and that we can move ahead. There we go. Okay, the panel is being populated by smiley faces. Great, wonderful. Okay, let's begin then. We have two simple goals this morning. We want to deepen your understanding of the critical decisions Abraham Lincoln made as a wartime president, and we want to provide you some fresh approaches and material with which to teach Lincoln's presidency. Now, many of you participated in the forum before the seminar, and I've gone through the forum, and I've mined these four major themes out of it. All of you asked for deeper knowledge of Abraham Lincoln. Right now, if you teach Abraham Lincoln, you sort of run the Lincoln highlight film. Cover the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the election as a cause of his election as a cause of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and his assassination. You wanted deeper information about Lincoln. For example, how did his views on slavery and emancipation evolve? Was he justified in suspending civil liberties during the Civil War? Did he violate the Constitution as commander-in-chief? And many of you asked what accounts for his ongoing popularity. Well, to help us address those questions, we are very pleased to have with us today Matthew Pinsker, who is the Associate Professor of History and the Pohanka Chair in American Civil War History at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Matt's research focuses on the career of Abraham Lincoln, partisanship in the Civil War era, American constitutionalism, the Underground Railroad, and the history of U.S. campaigns and elections. So right now, let me turn the seminar over to Matt, who will lead us through a discussion of Lincoln's presidency. Matt, it's all yours.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you to everybody who's participating. I'm looking forward to the exchange, although I'm a little nervous about some of the technology, but I am excited about the content, which is it's a fascinating new era in Lincoln studies. Last year was his bicentennial, and believe it or not, despite 16,000 books, there's an awful lot of new information, especially new perspectives on some old and important topics like emancipation and civil liberties. So that's what I wanted to focus on today. I will try to speak a little louder, and if you don't have trouble or if you have any trouble hearing me, please let me know, and I'll keep trying to adjust the volume and make it better. Um, but let me begin by turning to the first slide in our presentation, which is a fragment that Lincoln wrote in the moment between when he was elected president in November 1860 and when he became president in March of 1861. Abraham Lincoln received a letter from Alexander Stephens. He and Stephens had known each other in Congress. Some of you may know Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy, a leading Southern politician from Georgia, and he was a very strong advocate for Southern rights and for slavery. And he told Abraham Lincoln in the period between his election and his inauguration, specifically in an exchange they had in December, that if Lincoln wanted to stave off all of this talk of secession, he needed to say something about his desire to act within the Constitution. The phrase he used was from the book of Proverbs. He told Abraham Lincoln that a word fitly spoken would be like an apple of gold in a picture of silver. That comes from Solomon's Proverbs. So Lincoln responded and thought over what Stephens had written, and it bothered him apparently because he wrote this fragment. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. He never sent this to Stephens, but he did write it down and think it over. And I actually think it's very revealing about what Lincoln's ideas were on the eve of his presidency, especially about the Constitution, which he says here is not the apple of gold. So I was curious to see if people can think over what the apple of gold was to Lincoln. What is the principle that would represent a higher value than the Constitution? This is an important question.
Okay.
Is there a higher law than the Constitution?
Okay. Interesting question. Is there a higher law? What is that apple of gold? We'll take a few seconds here to frame their answers, send them to us. If anybody wants to raise a hand, it's a good time to do it. I'm seeing things in the chat. Okay. Here we go. Natural law. I think the supreme law of the land we teach. God-given rights, Jack Carter writes. Personal liberty. Any other suggestions? Basic rights and freedoms. Okay.
Good.
Okay, Matt,
Well,
what do you make of those responses?
they're good. Abraham Lincoln said here in his document, which you can access or which some of you may have already accessed from the prior readings, he said it was liberty to all was the principle that was embedded in the Declaration of Independence. And this is the moment in time when Lincoln begins to explain to himself and to others a philosophy that he's going to make clear at the Gettysburg Address. This is an important fragment you could use to help teach the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln argues that the American mission is defined first by the Declaration, and it's the Constitution that makes it more perfect. But the mission itself is not some neutral, rules-based compact between states, but it's rather a mission dedicated to freedom and equality for people, and that the government, the Union, and the Constitution have to find ways to promote freedom and equality in order to deserve their place. The apple is liberty to all. The silver around the picture is the Constitution and the frame of government. Now, another way to put that is basic rights or natural rights, but what Lincoln seems to be suggesting to Americans is that they need to remember that the original statement of those natural rights principles were embedded in the Declaration. Now, this is interesting because Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer. I mean, if there's one thing you need to know about him and his background, it's that he was trained as a lawyer who believed in the rule of law, who practiced law very seriously for decades. But over the course of his political career, first in the Illinois legislature, and then one term in Congress, and then in those famous political battles he had with Stephen Douglas in the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln came to see a more expansive view of the law, not just a rules-bound, rigid process of adhering to statutes and constitutions, but of understanding that those statutes and the Constitution had to find ways to execute and make real the principles of the Declaration. And so this is a moment in time on the eve of him becoming president that explains an evolution in his philosophy that is going to set the stage for something he's going to do that's kind of remarkable. He is going to become one of the most aggressive commanders-in-chief in American history, and he is going to become the great emancipator. Neither one of those things were evident in his earlier career. He was a lot of things. He was a good writer. He was a powerful debater. He was a good lawyer. He was an effective politician. But it's pretty hard to see him as an emancipator, willing to free slaves by military force. It's difficult to see this Whig lawyer and politician who criticized Andrew Jackson as an aggressive, expansive-minded commander-in-chief. But that's, in effect, what Lincoln's going to become. So what we have to teach our students is how this transformation played out. And it turns out that there's a lot of new information about that, and that's what I want to begin to discuss. For example, when Lincoln becomes president in March of 1861, at that moment in time, the Confederacy has been born. 7 states from the Deep South have seceded. But I think what everyone realizes is that the 7 states seceding is not the same as the entire South seceding. In fact, there were 15 slave states in 1861. So a majority remain in the Union after Lincoln's inauguration. And he has to decide at the outset of his presidency how he is going to proceed, whether he's going to try to conciliate the remaining slave states or whether he's going to threaten to coerce the seceding states and in doing so risk driving the other 8 slave states or some of them out of the Union into this new Confederacy. This is the tricky navigation he conducts in March and April. This is what we're about to celebrate, the 150th anniversary of the outset of the Civil War. I guess I shouldn't say celebrate, right, but commemorate that difficult period is what happened in March and April. And there are many aspects to that, of course, the whole story of Fort Sumter. But today I wanted to focus on the beginnings of the challenge that emerged in Maryland. And what you're looking at in this picture is a very interesting effort to commemorate both the uh, riot that happened on April 19th, 1861 in Baltimore, when Union troops were trying to rush to defend the nation's capital after the firing on Fort Sumter, but also the reference to the American Revolution, the Lexington of 1861, and the ambivalence that that represents. Both sides claim to be heirs to the American Revolution. That's something that I think is probably clear to teachers in the South, but maybe gets lost in translation in other sections of the country. But both the Confederates and the Unionists invoked the American Revolution to justify what they were doing. That is a moment of, grave political crisis for Abraham Lincoln. The riot that occurred as Union troops were passing through Baltimore, here depicted as this battle like Lexington and Concord, is a threat to the very nature of the Union. If Maryland, which is a slave state, falls to the secessionists, and Washington, which is an island between Maryland and Virginia, falls to the secessionists, Washington is also slave territory, then the very fate of the war could be decided in the opening weeks. And if you want to demonstrate, how severe this crisis appeared to the president, to the Unionists in April of 1861, you need to look no further than this quotation from Abraham Lincoln's letter to his general-in-chief, Winfield Scott. It's April 25th, 1861. He says, "I therefore conclude that it is only left to the commanding general to watch and await their action." This is the action of the Maryland legislature contemplating a secession vote, "and to adopt the most prompt and efficient means to counteract secession, even if necessary to the bombardment of their cities, and of course, in the extremest necessity, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus." Now, this opens up a couple of interesting questions. First, right away now, Lincoln is contemplating bombarding Baltimore and Maryland cities in a way that suggests how quickly the war is going to escalate. But also, you'll notice that he says here, and of course, in the extremest necessity, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. This is the doctrine of civil liberty. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, there is a suspension clause. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. The principle of habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus, known as the Great Writ, derives from the Magna Carta and British common law, but it was applied in the United States as a doctrine of producing the body, of guaranteeing a judicial process for anyone arrested by the government. It was one of the few civil liberties written into the original text of the Constitution. It was one of the foundational liberties of the country. And yet, the founders agreed that it could be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion. Lincoln thinks this is a moment of time that speaks directly to the fear of Article 1, Section 9. This is a rebellion. The picture we just saw a minute ago depicts that rebellion in full force, and it invokes the American Revolution. And now Lincoln is warning his general that they may need to suspend civil liberties. Of course, this is one of the most controversial decisions that Abraham Lincoln ever made. As Jack Carter just noted in the chat, the answer to the question, which branch has the power to suspend civil liberties according to the Constitution, may be Congress. Article 1 is the legislative article of the U.S. Constitution. However, is there any ambiguity in that authority? Is there any grounds for challenging that claim?
Henry Couch writes that it's not clearly stated. So he feels there is some ambiguity.
And what does that mean, not clearly stated? What is unclear here about the authority of the suspension clause?
Henry, would you like to click in and talk about that? Meanwhile, we hear that he's commander-in-chief and is looking for public welfare. That's an argument. And what constitutes rebellion and invasion? There are things that needed to be defined in that clause. So much of the Constitution requires that. It's in Article 1, okay. Jack echoes you, Matt. There seems to be room for interpretation there.
Well, there's room for debate, rather then and now. The last chat from Henry Couch says the section does not specifically state who has the power, is an argument that Lincoln's administration used to justify what he was doing. The article is the legislative article, but the sentence does not begin, Congress shall not suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. In other words, as good teachers, we should all know this is almost like passive voice here. This is an element that the Lincoln administration seized upon and magnified because at this moment in time, and this is an important bit of context to remind your students, Congress was not in session. In the 19th century, Congress was rarely in session. And the results from congressional elections, which did not occur uniformly in November, they were still being tabulated and verified. So, the new Congress wasn't yet in place, and Abraham Lincoln was acting alone in Washington. And so what he says, in effect, and then in various writings later in the war, is that he had a choice. He could honor the general understanding of the Constitution's suspension clause by accepting that only Congress could do it. But in doing so, then he would risk the whole fate of the Union, and he would have to wait for Congress to come back into session. Or he could seize upon what he thought was the essential flexibility of this text to allow himself, as commander-in-chief, to make a common-sense decision based on necessity. Now, he makes this claim and is immediately denounced by the Chief Justice of the United States of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney. This is probably the gravest constitutional crisis in American history, because what happens after Lincoln authorizes the suspension of habeas corpus along the rail lines through Maryland to Washington is that federal authorities arrest a number of people, including John Merriman, who was an officer in a secessionist militia group near Baltimore. Merriman was a very prominent figure in Maryland. He was a major farmer, actually. He specialized in the production of manure, and he was a leading political figure. Later, he would become state treasurer of Maryland. And he had a wide network of important political and social contacts. And his lawyer was a friend of Roger Taney's, who was a native of Maryland and a long-time Maryland attorney. And so when Roger Taney, acting as Chief Justice and also serving as the circuit court judge for the district that included Maryland, was approached by attorneys for John Merriman after he was arrested and held without hearing, held, by the way, at Fort McHenry, which is the location where Francis Scott Key was in the harbor at Baltimore in 1814 watching the city come under attack, and it was the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, flying over Fort McHenry that Francis Scott Key wrote about that has since become the national anthem. It was that fort that was being used as the political prison in the early weeks of the Civil War, and it was that fort where John Merriman was being held, and it was that fort where the general in charge refused an order from the Chief Justice to produce John Merriman at a hearing before him to determine whether or not the charges were valid. This, set in motion a constitutional crisis. Chief Justice Taney issued a ruling. In fact, it might be fair to say he issued an opinion. Ex parte Merriman was published in the newspapers on June 3rd, 1861. He never actually ordered the president to release Merriman. He decided against doing that because he understood that, or at least he predicted, that the president would simply ignore that order. But instead, he issued an opinion denouncing Lincoln for authorizing the suspension of habeas corpus without congressional approval. And in his opinion, he said this: I can only say that if the authority which the Constitution has confided to the Judiciary Department and the judicial officers may thus, upon any pretext or under any circumstances, be usurped by the military power at its discretion, the people of the United States are no longer living under a government of laws. Now, that is as harsh an indictment of a president as has ever been witnessed by a member of the Supreme Court, by a Chief Justice. But this is actually a more complicated moment than it looks. And there is a new interpretation of this moment that's actually changing the way I teach the civil liberties moment. And I think it should be something that you might want to consider, especially if you teach civics.
Okay, Matt, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but some of our folks, the volume is dropping a little low. So could you please speak up? We're having some technical difficulties, apparently.
Okay. So let me test the volume now. I'm talking a little louder. Can people hear?
How's that, folks? If that's okay, send us a smiley face. It seems to be better. If you could keep it at that level, Matt, I think everybody'd be happy.
Okay.
Okay, maybe a little louder. I don't want to strain your vocal cords, but some folks are just not getting. Let me ask you this: does your headset have a little switch on the wire, and the wire that leads to the computer?
Let me try that.
If it does, there's a thing. It's the microphone icon. There's a little wheel has a volume control. Sorry to be interrupting, folks, but we want everybody to hear.
No, it doesn't have anything like that.
Okay. All right. Then it's just Matt. I don't know what the problem is, Matt. If you could just, hold forth and destroy your voice for the rest of the classes today.
All right. I'll hold the microphone closer. And that
there we go.
Too.
Okay. How's that, folks? Does that work for you?
All right. We'll get there.
Okay, that's better.
All right.
Much better. Okay. There we go.
Good,
Great.
good,
Thank you.
right.
Thank you, man. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Now, we have this grave moment. Roger Taney has just accused the President of the United States of usurping the authority of the Constitution. He says the United States is no longer living under a government of laws, but there is a new article by a man named Mark Neely. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who's really written an awful lot about the civil liberties question. And he's pointed out something that all of us have overlooked, which is on the one hand, Abraham Lincoln is clearly extending his authority at the very least, and perhaps usurping his authority at the very worst by taking this Article 1 suspension clause and making it his own. But he points out that Roger Taney is expanding his authority as well in a very dramatic way. And this is a little complicated, but it's worth explaining for 5 minutes because it's something that most of us have never heard before and don't teach in the classroom, although it's a great civics issue. So as you may remember, the Supreme Court is defined in its authority in Article 3 of the Constitution. And that authority is, at least for the Supreme Court, is not expandable by statute. And if you want to remember that principle, the easiest way to do it is that was the principle at stake in Marbury versus Madison, the famous 1803 judicial review case, where part of the Judiciary Act was thrown out because it expanded the authority of the Supreme Court to issue rulings in certain types of cases. Well, it turns out that one of those elements of rulings that were issued in addition to the authority provided in the Constitution was the ability to issue writs of habeas corpus. And so by ordering, or by at least opining that he could order the release of John Merriman through a habeas corpus directive, Roger Taney was relying on the same sort of statutory authority that had been ruled unconstitutional by John Marshall's court in 1803. And Mark Neely points out that Roger Taney, who we don't know very well anymore, was far and away, the most distinguished jurist of the era. He had succeeded John Marshall as Chief Justice. He had been Chief Justice since 1835. By the way, just so you know, he's a Dickinson College graduate where I teach. He was a profound legal thinker, and Neely says he absolutely would have realized that he was stepping into an area that was at the very least dubious, at the very worst a usurpation of his own authority, in the same way that Marshall had ruled that the courts had benefited from an unconstitutional Judiciary Act from 1789 in the famous Marbury case. And so when you step back with this new information, what you have here is a president and a chief justice who are engaged in a battle royal over a major constitutional issue, each one expanding his authority as much as he possibly can, and each one determined to outduel the other because of a principle that they believe is at stake. Lincoln fighting for the Union, Tawney fighting ever since the Dred Scott case to stop the influence of the Republicans and the abolitionists from what he thought was a radical betrayal of the agreement over slavery that had been embedded in the original Constitution.
Matt, let me ask, we had a question earlier. Where was Tawney from?
Tawney was a native of Maryland. He had been a Maryland slaveholder who emancipated his own slaves, but he retained an affection and a sympathy for Southerners and slaveholders.
Okay, thank you.
Now, at this point, I also think it's good to step back and ask others if they have questions. We covered a lot of constitutional ground quickly, and maybe some of it was being covered when the microphone volume was too low. So,
okay. Are there any questions? Everybody with us so far? Here's a chance to clarify things that you may have missed when we were having our audio difficulties. Great stuff. Okay. All right. Did other justices follow Tawney?
well, you know why this is such a good question to ask is because Tawney is acting here on his own. Now, this is not ex parte Merriman is not a Supreme Court decision. It is an opinion of a chief justice in chambers. He hasn't yet issued a ruling demanding the president act. What he's done is he's issued an opinion describing the president's action as unconstitutional. This is complicated ground. It has legal force, but what type of legal force and in what setting is still debated by scholars.
And Laura Wakefield asked a kind of summary question. So Tawney felt the Republicans were usurping the Constitution by their anti-slavery views.
Yes, as everybody knows, the Constitution does not include the word slavery. Lincoln said they left it out because they were ashamed. But others believe that the Constitution left out the word, but it protected the institution in a variety of different ways. The Fugitive Slave Clause, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the protection against ending the African slave trade until 1808. And so there are two different ways to look at what the Constitution stood for on the question of slavery. Lincoln's view, the Republican view, certainly the abolitionist view, or at least the anti-slavery view, was that the Constitution was looking forward toward the destruction of slavery. But the Southern view, the states' rights view, argued that the Constitution protected the rights of states to keep slavery if they wanted it.
And Jack Carter asked, how and where was the Merriman decision published?
It was published directly in the newspapers. It wasn't even delivered to the White House first. And so there's another example here of the battle royal between Tawney and Lincoln. They are engaged in a public pitched battle. When we think about the outbreak of the Civil War, we focus on North versus South. But there is an important element here that's about the battle within the North between Democrats and Republicans. Tawney is a Jacksonian Democrat who's concerned that these anti-slavery Republicans are ripping apart the Union. And he is appealing, even while he's invoking legal authority, he's appealing in a very political way to the Democratic votes in the North.
Was this published in any of the papers that Lincoln shut down?
Well, Lincoln hasn't yet shut down any newspapers. There will be some newspapers that will be shut down in New York and in other places later in the conflict. But we're still literally, 2 or 3 weeks into this battle, into the suspension of civil liberties. So nothing has yet been censored.
I see. So Angela Chapin asked, any of the other justices read this pre-ruling before deciding the case?
So remember, no other justices were involved. This is the opinion of a single justice. It is not a Supreme Court decision. In other words, it's a federal judge, and instead of issuing a directive or a ruling, he issues an opinion. How are you supposed to respond to that? This is uncharted waters, and this is how Lincoln responds to it if we're ready to move forward, right?
I think we are.
Okay. Lincoln responds to this by calling Congress into special session and taking the case to them. He has this argument with Tawney that's been played out in public, and it's critical to the outcome of the war, and so he asks them to help resolve it. So he frames the issue to them in a very profound way in the special message, which, by the way, is delivered to Congress in print, not in person, on July 4th, 1861. That's the symbolism of that was intentional. Must a government of necessity, he says, be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? He claims the whole idea of a representative democracy is at stake in this battle with the secessionists and also by implication in this battle with Chief Justice Tawney. And in the next quotation there from the special message, Lincoln explains what he did. Now, I'm going to point something out here about this passage. He says, to state the question more directly, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself to go to pieces, lest that one be violated? Now, I think most people have seen and heard that question asked before in this context. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, lest that one be violated? This is what you might call a plain utilitarian, calculus. It's possible for a president or a commander-in-chief to break some laws in order to save more laws. But that's not Lincoln's defense. Look at the rest of the paragraph and think about how you would explain this to your students. Even in such a case, would not the official oath be broken if the government should be overthrown, when it was believed that disregarding this single law would tend to preserve it? Then he says, but it was not believed that this question was presented. It was not believed that any law was violated. Now think carefully about those last two sentences. They're so remarkable. He switches to the passive voice. He seems maybe perhaps uncomfortable in taking responsibility for this, but what he is saying here is that he doesn't believe the answer to these questions matter yet because he thinks everything he's done is authorized within the exceptions of the Constitution. I will go a little further. Lincoln never admits at any point in the war that he intentionally violated the Constitution. He claims from beginning to end everything he did was within the spirit of necessity that the Constitution authorizes, especially in time of war, rebellion, or invasion, or in matters where commanders-in-chief have to use their discretion. Does anybody want to ask a question about that?
While we're waiting for that, Julie Joyner has asked, is this the famous Independence Day speech from Lincoln?
Well, Lincoln had a few Independence Day speeches. This is a famous one. The July 4th special message wasn't a speech. It was a written document, but it is a very profound one that's frequently quoted in textbooks.
Okay, and Samantha Bowman writes, it's interesting that this issue comes full circle to the issues addressed in Article 1.
Absolutely. And I'll go even further than that. If you look at the final paragraph here, Lincoln does something else, which I think helps explain his point of view. I mean, I think most people can understand, just because Lincoln says what he did was within the Constitution doesn't mean that it was. And so how do you resolve that when a commander-in-chief or a president is making sweeping assertions? You may remember from Richard Nixon's days, Nixon once said when a president does it, it's not against the law. That, that might be one way to interpret Lincoln's comments here. But I think he offers a different rationale than Nixon had done, and one that's more profound. He says at the end of his special message, it is with the deepest regret that the executive found the duty of employing the war power in defense of the government forced upon him. He could but perform this duty or surrender the existence of the government. In full view of his great responsibility, he has so far done what he has deemed his duty. You will now, according to your own judgment, perform yours. Okay. Think about what he just said to the Congress. He has made a series of decisions that he believes his oath and his office have vested him. Now he's asking them to make a series of decisions or offer a series of responses that he believes their oath and their office has invested in them. You will now, according to your own judgment, perform yours. In my article, in my article that I submitted as a pre-read for this class, what I suggested was this is the chronology of powers. We always talk about a separation of powers, but I believe what Lincoln argues in his actions, if not actually in phrases, is that during war in particular, there is a chronology of power. The president acts, the Congress reacts, the court reviews, and then the people decide. And that's essentially what we're going to cover today. The president acts. He has almost unlimited initiative to act in a time of crisis, to do what he believes is necessary. But the Congress can restrain or change his actions by their oversight and reaction, by addressing his concerns. Lincoln asked them to rule on this question of habeas corpus. It's interesting, of course. They did rule on it. I mean, they did write a statute that defined how and when the president could suspend civil liberties. They didn't get around to it, though, until the spring of 1863. That's the difference between an executive and a legislative. Legislation is more deliberative, it's slower, it's messier. Executives can act with more dispatch. This is another reason why Lincoln believes in a chronology of powers. In a time of crisis, you have to rely on executive action. Even if it's wrong, it's the only solution. But he doesn't believe that executives have unlimited authority. Their authority is bound in time. So the Congress now, after July 4th, has the responsibility to react, and eventually the courts will have the authority to review. If you think about it, that's why Lincoln was so determined to resist Roger Taney's opinion in Merriman. He thought Taney jumped the line, that he violated the chronology that was supposed to be in play here. And that's why I believe Lincoln considered Taney to be his gravest enemy during this crisis, someone willing to upend the Constitution for his own means to stop the Union war effort.
And Greg Hawes asks here, if I might interject, does Lincoln know the extent of the Southern secession commissioners, since they have states that have left the Union at this point? Is he aware of how powerful the secession movement is? I would assume he is.
By July, 11 states have left the Union to form the Confederacy. After the firing on Fort Sumter, 4 more joined the 7 from the Deep South who seceded. Lincoln is fully aware of the power of the secession movement by July. He still, cultivates this hope that there are white Southerners and black Southerners who resist the Confederacy and will help undermine it. But what he's really focused on by this point is the need to keep those 4 remaining slave states in the Union. That would be Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. He obviously needs Maryland. You can see the value of it. And that's what the civil liberties issue is all about. But he says at one point, I think most people remember this, he'd like to have God on his side, but he needs Kentucky. All of these slave states in the border areas that remained in the Union, they were critical to the Union's success.
Okay. You can go ahead.
What I was about to say was that the initial actions that Lincoln took at the outbreak of the war were not just about civil liberties. With Congress out of session, he also raised troops, he spent money, he set foot a blockade, which in international law was an act of war. He took a number of steps that, according to constitutional principle, had always been considered the authority of Congress. And so these were all questions that the Congress and the courts had to respond to. The Congress, as I mentioned earlier, they authorized the suspension of habeas corpus in spring of '63, but they responded more quickly to the other matters, and they set forward a number of statutes and provisions that extended what Lincoln had done to start the war. And the courts reviewed them. This is sometimes lost in the shuffle of all we have to do with the Civil War. But in the spring of 1863, the Supreme Court, the full court, in a very split ruling, 5-4, in a case called the prize cases, they authorized Lincoln's actions. They said he didn't have to wait for Congress to define the terms of the conflict, that he was vested with a broad commander power at the outset of the conflict. The prize case's decision in the spring of '63 did not directly address civil liberties. but it did address the other matters like the blockade. And they gave Lincoln authorization to act without Congress in session when the nation was threatened in the way that it had been by the secession movement.
We have a question here.
About that?
Yes, we do actually. Peter Billingsley writes, why didn't Lincoln call Congress into session to address all those other issues?
So he did call Congress into special session, but the question, I guess, really is why didn't he push them faster to come back to Washington before July 4th? I think there is no written evidence to document why he did what he did, but there's obvious speculation that he didn't want Congress to come back too quickly because he wanted wider latitude. He wasn't sure yet who was loyal or who was disloyal. There's also a practical question that I mentioned briefly before. Elections in those years for Congress were not all in November, and so the returns were coming in sporadically. Not all members of Congress had their elections certified by March and April of 1861.
And Jack Carter asked, were Southern Democrats called back to Congress?
The Congress was called back into special session, but the Southerners refused to come. They would then be excluded from the deliberations of the Congress and from the Electoral College for the remainder of the war. And a couple of members of the Supreme Court left as well.
Okay.
If we look at the next slide, you see Lincoln speaking again a couple of years later in reflection, but also in chronological terms. He says, imbued with a reverence for the guaranteed rights of individuals, I was slow to adopt strong measures, which by degrees I have been forced to regard as being within the exceptions of the Constitution and as indispensable to the public safety. Nothing is better known to history than that courts of justice are utterly incompetent to such cases. So, I think this is a remarkable snapshot as well into Lincoln's view of himself and how in some ways, it'll contrast with how our students will receive his actions. He says he was slow to adopt strong measures. I just described a series that occurred within weeks of the conflict, sees himself in the way some of our students will perceive him. He says it was all within the exceptions of the Constitution and indispensable to public safety, and then goes on to say that courts are utterly incompetent to such cases. And I think it's an important question to ask. Why would Lincoln be so dismissive of courts and judges in these wartime cases, especially involving civil liberties? Is this a fair point to stop, Richard, do you think, and ask if people want to chat in their answers or raise their hands?
Sure. All right, why was Lincoln so dismissive of the courts and judges in wartime civil liberties cases? Because he's the one dealing. Courts are slow and deliberative, and you need to move quickly. Joe Linda writes. Any other comments? Anyone want to click in and raise a hand? The courts just tell him what he can and can't do. In crisis, you have to react quickly. That seems to be a consensus. They had to. So much for chronology of power. Urgency. It fits his agenda, Samantha Bowman writes. Who were the judges and what were their leanings? Well, it seems to be that people are saying you have to move quickly in an emergency, and the courts are slow and deliberative. Have they gotten it right?
Well, the question of right or wrong, is subjective. But what I'm arguing here is that speed matters, and that's part of it. But the other aspect of this is security matters. And this is one answer I was looking for that I don't know if I've seen yet, which is that Lincoln thinks courts are incompetent to making national security decisions. These are people, as profound and as learned as they might be, they're not elected to office. They are not on the ground. They don't have military training or full access to all of the military facts. The question of leanings and loyalties is an important one. How can you expect judges to determine these things, especially under the deadlines looming? All of these factors, speed and security, combined together, I think, to lead Lincoln to believe that judges have to step back out of the process. Now, the comment from Peter, so much for the chronology of power, I take that as a fair criticism of my viewpoint, but my response is Lincoln doesn't believe that courts are utterly incompetent to reviewing these cases, but that they are utterly incompetent to deciding them at the moment of uh, initial action, that they need to await and reflect rather than intervene. I want to move to emancipation, which will further illustrate some of these issues. Is that fair? Does anybody need to ask any other questions or make any comments that we need to discuss before we shift gears?
Anything more about civil liberties before we move on to emancipation? Okay, Matt, I think we're ready to go into emancipation. We've got about 40 minutes remaining.
Okay. So Abraham Lincoln makes these bold, decisive moves on civil liberties, but when it comes to emancipating slaves, he seems more cautious. In the summer of 1861, there was a general named John Fremont who decides he's going to emancipate slaves in Missouri as part of his military effort to defeat the secessionists there. Lincoln rescinds his emancipation edict, and then he writes a letter to an old friend of his named Orville Browning in September, where he seems to dismiss the whole principle of emancipation. If you look at the fragment from the letter there, he says at one point that you speak of it as being the only means of saving the government. This is right in the middle of the paragraph. On the contrary, it is itself the surrender of the government. Can it be pretended that it is any longer the government of the U.S., wherein a general or a president may make permanent rules of property by proclamation? I do not say Congress might not with propriety pass a law on the point, just as General Fremont proclaimed. I do not say I might not as a member of Congress vote for it. What I object to is that I, as president, shall expressly or impliedly seize and exercise the permanent legislative functions of the government. This is another fascinating moment in our study of Abraham Lincoln, because here in September of '61, he seems to flatly deny that generals or presidents can issue proclamations of emancipation. And a year later, he's going to do that very act. And so you have to explain what changed. If you remember the facts of emancipation policy, I think there's one part of the story that helps begin to explain how Lincoln's view evolved that is often overlooked. And I did want to emphasize it here in this presentation because I don't think most people see much about this in their textbooks or have time to think about it in the classroom, but it's so critical. It's called confiscation policy. So stop for a second and think to yourself if you remember and understand what confiscation policy was. Confiscation is the congressional term for emancipation. It involves the confiscation of property that the Congress authorized in two different laws. The first was in the summer of '61, and the second was in the summer of '62. The Second Confiscation Act, which was passed on July 17th, 1862, is the one you're looking at there. You're looking at one section of it. This is the emancipation section. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to describe how Lincoln reacted to this and how it really is a trigger for his evolution on this question. Section 9, and be it further enacted that all slaves of persons who shall hereafter be engaged in rebellion against the government of the United States, or who shall in any way give aid or comfort thereto, escaping from such persons and taking refuge within the lines of the army, and all slaves captured from such persons or deserted by them, and coming under the control of the government of the United States, and all slaves of such persons found or being within any place occupied by rebel forces and afterwards occupied by the forces of the United States shall be deemed captives of war and shall be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. So this is a major leap forward for the Union. It redefines the war. It presents a challenge to Lincoln, however, because what it says is that Congress can pass a law that makes slaves forever free. And he said in his letter to Browning that he believed that that was the only way it could be done. But when he was confronted with this act in July of '62, he prepared to veto it. He said at the time it was unconstitutional, that after reflection, after his exchange with Browning, after months of thinking this through, he had decided that no, only presidents could take this action and only under the guise of military necessity, using their authority as commander-in-chief. he was worried that the Confiscation Act, I'm quoting here, was unconstitutional. He wrote a veto message that he prepared to deliver. This, after the Tawney confrontation, is the second gravest political or constitutional crisis of the war for Abraham Lincoln. Think about this. If he vetoes an emancipation measure passed by Republican Congress, it could disrupt the entire Union coalition. And in fact, he's so overwrought by this. Orville Browning, the recipient of that earlier letter, he comes to the White House while Lincoln's writing the veto message and says he's worried about Lincoln's health. He says Lincoln has tears in his eyes as they talk about it. That's how overwrought he was. So Browning and Lincoln decide to keep trying to negotiate with the Congress, and eventually Lincoln convinces the members of Congress, the leadership on Capitol Hill, to issue some resolutions addressing his concerns, and he agrees to sign the bill on July 17th. But when he signs it, he issues his veto message with it. Now, this is a bit of a trivia quiz, but I at the risk of overwhelming the technology here, I wanted to see, does anybody know what we call that when a president issues his constitutional objections to a bill that he signs, like Lincoln did with the Second Confiscation Act?
Anyone know what we call that today? I think we saw some examples of that in the previous signing statement.
Yes. So this is not in the civics textbooks. It's not in the Constitution. But the reason why I think Julie got it right is because George W. Bush issued more signing statements than any other president in American history. But in effect, what Lincoln did on July 17th was issue a signing statement. He expressed his objections to the constitutionality of a bill that he signed. Well, you can imagine this infuriates congressmen. That's why, as Peter points out, Bush got all kinds of heat for this, because people understand what to do with a veto. Congress can override it or not. But what do you do with a signing statement? Does that mean the president is not going to enforce those aspects of the bill he considers unconstitutional? And further, Lincoln thought that the Confiscation Act was impractical. If you look carefully at that Section 9, what it says is that the slaves of persons who are supporting the Confederacy or who are involved in the Confederate actions, that they will be freed. But the rest of the act makes clear that slaves of loyal masters, of those who are not participating in the rebellion, they will not be freed. In other words, there has to be some sort of judicial process, some sort of hearing to determine whether or not slaves will be forever free. This was, an impractical condition in Lincoln's terms, and it was also, at this point, he decided unconstitutional. The reason he was convinced, by the way, I think, that it was unconstitutional is because he was so fearful of what Roger Taney in the court might do. That battle he had had the year before had set the stage for him to be exceptionally wary about what would happen next. But emancipation is the trigger for Lincoln to decide he has to do something on emancipation. And the trigger is one that we've always tried to identify. I mean, over the years, figuring out exactly when Lincoln changed his mind on emancipation has been really tricky. But I'm showing you right now a document that's never before appeared in any book or article about Lincoln or emancipation, at least until I wrote about it a couple years ago. And what's interesting about this from our perspective as teachers is that it's a letter from Lincoln's personal secretary, John Hay, who was 23 years old at the time. And he's writing to a 16-year-old girl named Mary J., who lived in New York. He was trying to court her. And he's writing from the White House Library on Sunday, July 20th, a few days after the Second Confiscation Act had been signed, and Lincoln had issued his signing statement. And now Lincoln is preparing to take the next step. He's writing a series of orders that were required by the Act, and he's preparing to write a first draft of emancipation to make this problem over confiscation go away. And I think in this letter, John Hay is describing that moment. If you read between the lines, you'll hear him, in effect, describing to the 16-year-old girl the birth of emancipation, Sunday afternoon, July 20th. He says the president himself has been, out of pure devotion to what he considers the best interests of humanity, the bulwark of the institution he abhors for a year, but he will not conserve slavery much longer. When he next speaks in relation to this defiant and ungrateful villainy, it will be with no uncertain sound. Even now he speaks more boldly and sternly to slaveholders than to the world. If I have sometimes been impatient of his delay, I am so no longer. Now, I love this for a lot of reasons, not just because I found it. And by the way, the reason I found it, I think, is an important insight. Online searching. John Hay wrote this letter to a 16-year-old girl in New York. The letter stayed in New York in the papers of the Jay family for years. Jay, by the way, was a descendant of John Jay, the first Chief Justice. But when you're writing a book about emancipation, why would you look in the Jay family papers in New York? And so historians who didn't go there and looking for it didn't find it. But because it was available online, it was published by the Gilder Lehrman Institute, digitized by them, I was able to find it from my desktop here in Carlisle. But the other reason I love it is you have a 23-year-old kid who says he's impatient with Abraham Lincoln. He's frustrated by the great emancipator. He's trying to impress this girl. But what he is describing, at least in my opinion, and you can tell this is also subjective, he's describing the moment that the first draft was written. And in case you're having trouble visualizing this, that's the first draft of Emancipation that Lincoln so famously read to his cabinet 2 days later. So the Hay letter is from Sunday, July 20th. The picture that we all know so well is from Tuesday, July 22nd. Lincoln and his cabinet met on Monday. They had a long series of discussions about the Confiscation Act. They finished their meeting on Tuesday morning, and this picture shows Lincoln reading the first draft of Emancipation, the one that I think Hay is describing him writing to that girl. Now, again, another sort of wrinkle to this. The picture, if you look carefully at it, it's not actually depicting Lincoln reading. If you look very carefully at the man in the center here, I'll try to use the highlighter. You see the man speaking here is actually William Seward, the Secretary of State, who's pointing at the table. And what he is telling Lincoln, I think, as you may remember, is that if this proclamation is to be issued, they should wait until there's a victory on the battlefield. That if you issue it now in the summer of 1862 after a series of defeats in Virginia, it'll look like the last shriek on retreat. This scene here is the White House Library. These are all the members of Lincoln's cabinet. There's Edwin Stanton here, Salmon Chase here, Gideon Welles here, William Seward here, Attorney General Edward Bates here, Postmaster General Montgomery Blair here, and Caleb Smith, the Secretary of Interior here. This picture, by the way, is at the Senate Historical Office, online at their site. It's in the U.S. Senate today. It's a famous painting by Francis Carpenter, and it will have full context and description of the nature of the painting and some of its symbolism. But I want to focus on Seward's point here, because when he tells Lincoln, if you plan to issue emancipation as a proclamation out of military necessity by Commander-in-Chief, and that you should do so only by waiting for a military victory, I think that raises an important question about military necessity. So let me rephrase and think about this. How does waiting for a victory undermine the constitutional rationale for the action?
Okay. How does waiting for a victory undermine the constitutional rationale? Okay. How does that undermine it? Well, just if I may take a crack at it, it seems that if it really is justified within the Constitution, you don't need to wait for a victory. You could move ahead and be perfectly justified in doing so without that military rationale.
Okay, that's good, but think about this. If you claim military necessity is what requires this action, then doesn't necessity lessen as victories increase? Necessity comes from defeats. In other words, you seem to undermine the basis, the rationale for this action. And the reason for that is because you are, in effect, acknowledging there's a political calculation involved. And in fact, that's what I just described. If you stop back and think over the whole business of confiscation and that whole long evolution Lincoln made from Browning to this moment, what I'm trying to argue is that what's driving a lot of this action, what's changing Lincoln's mind here, is political necessity more than military necessity. That he's come to see, for political reasons, that he needs to emancipate slaves, both to undermine the political balance in the Confederacy and to hold the Union coalition together. Does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about that?
Any comments or questions?
If you think about the politics of emancipation, that also helps explain this famous quotation, which I think many people know, but which not everybody understands in its context. This is a letter Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley. And by the way, just like Roger Taney published his opinion in the newspaper without giving it to Lincoln, this is a very interesting little twist. Lincoln writes this letter to Horace Greeley, who had been criticizing him in August of '62 for not acting on the Confiscation Act. Because remember, Lincoln read that first draft of emancipation to his cabinet, but he didn't make it public. He actually listened to William Seward, and he kept the draft quiet, waiting for a battlefield victory, the one that everybody knows is going to come for the Union at Antietam in Maryland in September. But as of August of '62, Horace Greeley, who's a famous newspaper editor, he doesn't see any movement at all. He doesn't know why the Second Confiscation Act hasn't been put into action. He's upset. So he wrote a newspaper editorial, an open letter to Lincoln criticizing him. And now Lincoln responds with an open letter to him that he publishes in a newspaper rather than sending to Greeley, by the way, in a rival newspaper, and he responds. And in responding, he says very famously, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." However, if you stop and think about this, Lincoln has already decided to free the slaves. He's waiting for the right moment to announce it. By expressing himself in public in this way, I don't think he's explaining to people what he really believes. He's preparing the ground for a decision he knows will be controversial. In other words, he's addressing an audience that will oppose the decision once it's announced. He knows that Horace Greeley will be thrilled, but he is wary of those who are unhappy about the prospects of emancipation. And so he wants to explain it to them in advance as about the Union, not about freedom. Any comments or questions about that?
Well, I have one comment. I've seen this. This is very famous, as you've mentioned, and I never put it in that kind of context before. That really gives a very different perspective on this this passage.
If you ask me, it changes everything. Although
Yeah.
I will admit, right, not everybody sees it that way, but this is what's interesting about a teaching moment. You don't have to force your students into one camp or the other on this, but you will teach them a fundamental principle of historical thinking, which is that you have to read documents in context.
Good point.
I want to turn to the final product of this whole episode, which is, again, another element of new information and interpretation. That is, emancipation from July to January of 1863, it evolves as well. The emancipation sentence from the first draft, the one that Lincoln was reading to his cabinet in July, it reads like this: "As a fit and necessary military measure for effecting this object, I, as Commander-in-Chief, do order and declare that on the first day of January, all persons held as slaves within any state or state wherein the constitutional authority of the United States shall not then be practically recognized, submitted to, and maintained, shall then, thenceforward, and forever be free." In the final version, the emancipation sentence reads like this: "And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons." Between July and January, as the administration moves toward making this all public and final, it was private through the summer. They announced their plans in public in September after the battle at Antietam, and then they debated the final wording of the proclamation through December. As all that was happening, they made some changes. And you can see literally one of the changes here. So let me ask the question: what is the word that's been lost from the first draft on July 22nd to the final draft on January 1st?
Okay, Laura, I think it was doing it as Commander-in-Chief in the first one. Okay.
Well, in fairness to Laura, I'll say, I did cut out an earlier sentence that invokes the same Commander-in-Chief clause. Lincoln doesn't include it in the final sentence the way he did in the first draft. The word all has been shifted, but there's a more important word that's now missing.
Jack Carter nominates constitutional.
It's fair. There's a historian named Alan Gelzo who's written a book called Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and he says that the key word that's been dropped is the word that Barbara just identified to us: forever. Forever free comes originally from the Confiscation Act. Lincoln used it a few days later in the first draft, but in the final version, he drops forever. And Gelzo makes a really interesting argument. He says that between July and January, Lincoln is worried about one person more than any other. He's worried about Roger Taney. He's worried about whether or not this court will throw out an Emancipation Proclamation. And forever is a red flag word. If you're going to make a military order on the basis of necessity and issue a proclamation, how can you claim it's forever? Now, I find that to be persuasive, although I've taken this to teachers. And especially when I have language arts teachers in the room, some of them will say, forever is just a redundant word, and therefore it should be dropped. And Lincoln is a good writer, and he realizes that. Although I will say, just as a Lincoln expert, he was redundant frequently in his proclamations, in his writings. And so when I think about all that was happening between July and January, I think that he is crafting this document in a way that will protect it from court review. If you look carefully at the final version, he doesn't talk at all about Congress or about the courts. You can see that in that sense. The executive government is the one that has to maintain this. He doesn't think the courts have any role to play in the initial maintenance of this document. He wants them to see this as an act of military necessity. And he does something else in this document that I find very revealing and useful in the classroom. In the final proclamation, he speaks directly to the freed slaves. This is the first time in American history that a president speaks directly in public in a written document to black people. And in that section, he says, "I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages, and I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service." In other words, how is Lincoln defining freedom? And because we're running short on time, I'll answer my own question here. He's defining freedom as work. Work for yourself, work for your country, work for your family. And what I do with my students is I ask them to define freedom first. And they usually define it as leisure. Freedom is the freedom not to do anything, not to come to your class. And so I ask them, well, why is Lincoln defining freedom as work? And the answer I try to get them to explain is that in his generation, they appreciated a certain element of responsibility to freedom that perhaps we take for granted because they lived in an era of slavery. They were far more blind than we are to issues of equality. It's not like they were perfect, but they might have had a deeper appreciation for freedom because they saw its opposite in existence all around them. Does anybody want to ask a question or make a comment about that? Because I do feel like that's one moment in the emancipation story that you could teach right down to the elementary level, and it makes an awfully profound impact on kids when they think about it in those terms.
Any questions? While you're framing your questions or comments, we know Jack Carter, he says that Lincoln here recognizes the enslaved as people rather than property, and Peter Billingsley echoes the Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition speech, put down your bucket. So in other words, that's Lincoln urging the same thing that Washington did many years later. Any questions or comments before we move ahead? Okay, Matt, I think we should plunge on.
Well, taking Jack's comment, that is the other greatest difference between how this process began and how it ends up. And it's the transformation that almost nobody talks about in classrooms, but I think people are going to start talking about in the next generation. That is, that this is no longer about confiscating property. It's no longer asset forfeiture. This is about freeing a people. Now, if you look at that last sentence, this is a brand new sentence in the Emancipation Proclamation. There's nothing quite like it in any of the earlier drafts. Lincoln says it would be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution and upon military necessity, and he invokes the considerate judgment of mankind. By the way, that's an echo to the Declaration, and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So here is the first time when he invokes God, and he talks about an act of justice. Well, there is no act of justice in confiscating property. But by speaking directly to black people as people, and by talking about the justice in freeing them, Lincoln is invoking natural rights in a way that also reminds us that by invoking natural rights, he's invoking international law. There's a new book called Act of Justice by a man named Burris Carnahan. He was a State Department lawyer in the Bush administration, and he's also a Lincoln historian. And he found that that phrase, act of justice, is actually a quotation. I never knew this, and his book just came out in 2007. But the quotation is from the confiscation debates. In those debates, Charles Sumner was describing a principle of international law that would justify freeing slaves during a time of war. He said, quoting an international legal theorist named Emmerich D. Vattel. Vattel is spelled V-A-T-T-E-L. He said, Vattel's principle was that it would be an act of justice to free slaves during times of war. It would be a just cause of war. Sumner and Salmon Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, went to Lincoln and they gave him a draft of this final sentence, and Lincoln included it in his proclamation. Now, he never invoked Vattel openly, but Lincoln did take international law seriously. At the same time, he's developing the Emancipation Proclamation. He's asking a university professor from New York, Francis Lieber, L-I-E-B-E-R, he's asking him to draft a code of conduct based on international law that would rule, that would guide the Union armies as they occupied the South. This is called the Lieber Code. In other words, the Lieber Code and the Emancipation Proclamation are rooted in principles of international law designed to make natural rights real. And they represent the wholesale shift of the Union, not just from maintaining the Union to emancipation, but from emancipating slaves on the grounds of confiscation to emancipating them on their natural rights as people under the authority of international law. And I know I'm rushing a bit here, but I wanted to make sure we identified this passage as the critical one. In a letter explaining his emancipation policy, written in the summer after it was issued, Lincoln says, I think the Constitution invests its commander-in-chief with the law of war and time of war. And I ask, what does Lincoln mean by the law of war? And there are many answers you could give, right? But the answer I think he intends is that the law of war is the international law of war. That phrase, law of war, is a term of art from Emmerich D. Vattel's book, The Law of Nations. And it describes international principles for guiding a commander-in-chief during times of war. Lincoln, in other words, is saying the higher law than the Constitution is international law. Now, this is a profound insight if you believe it, that the American government and its Constitution is bound by international law during times of war. You can see the ramification for this in moments like the War on Terror. And you can imagine how controversial this is. And so I don't expect everybody to agree with this interpretation. But I don't think it's an interpretation that most people have been exposed to. And it's one that has a lot of basis in fact. So I wanted to make sure I laid it out for you as quickly as I did, but at least laid it out for you in a way that you might consider exploring with your students, especially if you're teaching high school. Now, Peter, I rushed through a lot of things there. Should we stop and take questions or comments?
Yes. Any questions or comments before we move on to the last section? Hearing none, Matt, I think we should go ahead.
Okay. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but at the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln explained himself in a letter to a Kentucky newspaper editor named Albert Hodges, describing what he had done, and once again reiterating that he felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful, and therefore were authorized by the Constitution. And he says here at the end of this letter, right or wrong, I assume this ground and now avow it, you might consider that to be somewhat defiant or overly aggressive, even dictatorial. But I think what saves Lincoln from being reduced to dictatorship is that he submitted himself to the voice of the people. Not only did he run for re-election, but he ran on a platform of making the Emancipation Proclamation the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The Republicans adopted a 13th Amendment platform. They promised to make slavery abolished everywhere. And even when they were faced with defeat, Lincoln stood by that position. If you look at this memo, this is the blind memorandum of August 23rd, 1864. This is a note that Lincoln wrote. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. If you look carefully at the image in front of you, you can see the fold lines. Lincoln wrote this down on August 23rd. He folded it up into little squares and had members of his cabinet sign it on the back, testifying to the date without actually reading it. That's why we call it the blind memorandum. In other words, what Lincoln was doing at the moment of his lowest point in the reelection campaign, when he actually thinks that the administration will not be reelected, is he is preparing to assure the president-elect that he has no intention of canceling the elections, that he has no intention of holding power, because he's hoping that the president-elect will work with him between November and March to try to end the war. He might have done a number of other things. I mean, he could have, at this moment, and he was under a lot of pressure to do so, he could have abandoned emancipation. Just because he promised it doesn't mean he has to deliver it. He could have stepped down as an unpopular nominee and allowed the Republicans to put forward someone else. This is perhaps one thing you may consider that Lyndon Johnson did after the 10 Offensive in 1968. Lincoln doesn't step down. He doesn't abandon emancipation. He doesn't negotiate an end to the war. He stays the course at this moment and tries to convince his opponents with this secret memo that he would reveal after his defeat that he intends to turn over power. And that seems so obvious to us, but it wasn't to them. This is a president who suspended civil liberties for over 14,000 people. This is a president who freed slaves by military decree. The fact that he might cancel an election was not something that was considered impossible to imagine. But that was the one thing that Lincoln thought was essential to the chronology of power. If a president is going to take unlimited initiative, then he has to be bound by the decision of the people. President acts, Congress reacts, courts review, but ultimately it's the people who decide. And this is the last slide here.
Matt, before we go into that, we have a question here from Laura Wakefield. Let me pass the microphone to her. Laura, it's all yours.
This document really confused me, the blind memorandum, because the way I read it, I thought he was saying that he was going to do everything in his power to save the Union, to try to ensure that it could be saved between November and March if he wasn't reelected. And because he understood that if he was defeated, that would mean that whoever was elected was going to probably make concessions to the South and therefore end the war without saving the Union. Is that not what he meant?
Well, yes. I mean, he's worried that the Democrats will nominate. They haven't yet done so, but they'll nominate someone who's opposed to the war. But what that means is that when Lincoln loses, as you can imagine, you would expect the Union Army to fall apart. You would expect desertion rates to skyrocket. So what Lincoln is hoping that the president-elect will agree to do is cooperate with him, almost like co-presidents between November and March, so that they can hold the Union together and make one last push to try to crush the Confederacy. The theory being that the president-elect, would want this war taken care of before he took office. Does that answer your question?
Yes, somewhat, but I guess it just, he's the last clause where he says, as he, meaning I assume he meant the whoever was elected, will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. In other words, he's saying, if I'm not reelected, then the Union's dead. And so I'm going to do everything I can between November and March to make sure that I save it before then, so that it doesn't,
right.
my predecessor doesn't destroy it.
You can hear the profound bitterness in that last sentence, that last clause. But imagine, what is going through Lincoln's mind, because this memo is designed to be read by that president-elect. He's trying to convince the president-elect to cooperate with him. He's trying to convince the president-elect that he's known for weeks he would lose, and that the president-elect can trust him to turn over power, even though they oppose each other bitterly. And what he's hoping the president-elect will do is give him the weight he needs to keep the men in the Army.
Okay.
And what he's hoping the president-elect will see is that by doing that, he might give Lincoln a chance to end the war and take this problem away from his plate. But I'll admit this, right? It's very complicated. This is hard to figure out. This is one of the most mysterious documents of the Civil War. When Lincoln revealed its contents to his cabinet after the election, they were mystified. They asked him, they laughed, what did you think you were going to accomplish? I just explained very quickly what I thought he was trying to accomplish, that he was staying the course, he was trying to convince the president-elect in the event of Lincoln's defeat that they could work together. It's kind of a last desperate measure. But what I see in a moment like this from Lincoln is sheer determination. Not that he's so depressed and overwrought, but that he's come over the past 4 years to evolve a position that's firm and determined to, risk everything. And that includes putting himself and his policies before the people.
Matt, let me ask, did the public really think that he would cancel the election? How widespread or
so there were reports and fears about this in the public speeches of the campaign and in the newspapers. And of course, as I mentioned before, this is a man who threw 14,000 people in jail without civil liberties. It's not so unimaginable to think that he might refuse to turn over power. And that's why after the election he says this, it's long been a grave question whether any government not too strong for the liberties of its people can be strong enough to maintain its own existence. That's the same question he asked in the July 4th message. And then he concludes by saying the election was a necessity. We cannot have free government without elections. I find that to be, at the end of the day, Lincoln's most profound statement about the Constitution and his presidency. The Civil War was not civil because it was polite. It was civil because it was political. It began with one election, and it would end with another. And the battle was all over what it means to have a republic and whether elections are central to that republic or peripheral. And what Lincoln argues is they're central because that's the way the people express their sovereignty. When we talk about we the people and popular sovereignty, Lincoln argues that what that means in our system is that the people decide who represents them through elections.
Okay. All right. There's a debate going on in the chat. Let me put this question to you, Matt. Was Lincoln was he a man for the times, or did the times make the man? Where do you come down on that?
So it's a classic question, but it's really hard to answer. Both, right? He is representative of many elements of the day, and he reflects thinking of the day. I hoped that one of the things I showed today was that part of their thinking involved international law. They talked about international law and public sovereignty, popular sovereignty, in a way that they take far more seriously than perhaps we do today. And so I was hoping to expose you to how he was representative of that. But I also believe at a certain point, Lincoln is exceptional because he is able to make tough decisions through the power of thought and reasoning that I can't imagine any of his other peers were quite capable of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well put. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end. Let me ask if there are any questions. Laura has her hand up. Let me pass the microphone. Laura, it's all yours.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you. This was very, very interesting, and I really learned a lot. But I also wanted to just remind everyone that there is a new thing that we're doing this year, and that is the primary document analysis form. And you don't have to go into great depth. It's not creating a whole lesson. You're going to answer all of the applicable questions related to, you're going to select one of the documents or a section of a document and talk about how you might use it with students. And it doesn't have to be a full, I don't expect you to spend hours on it, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And it's kind of like an idea you might have for a lesson. And I want you to upload those into the Moodle site, and I'll give you almost 2 weeks. Well, let's say 2 weeks from today, which I think is December 1st. So that gives you over the Thanksgiving holiday if you don't have time this week to do it. But I also encourage you to do it soon while it's fresh in your mind. And I know that we'll have the recording available, and we'll also have the PowerPoint that he provided, so you can maybe, if you're interested in selecting something from there. So if you have questions about what to do, I'll try and upload one of my that I create within the next day or two, so that you all can see that you don't have to answer every single question that's there, just the important ones that relate to what you're doing. And that way you can take a look at that to get an idea.
Okay, and we have a question. Can folks do that with teammates?
No, I'd like to have everybody do one, just because I think it's a lot. I'd like to see it's just a gem of an idea. It's not a whole lesson. So if everybody would do that individually, and yes, Barbara, you can definitely use two, or you may be comparing two pieces from it or whatever. But I'd like you to just do it with by yourself, just so that we kind of get a wide variety of ideas.
Okay, great. Well, anybody else with closing comments or questions before we wrap things up here today? It's your last shot. All right. Now, let me urge you to use the forum. We will keep the forum going beyond our December 1st deadline, to allow you to upload all of those document application forms. Professor Pinsker will monitor the form and respond to your questions or comments if you have any of them now that come to you after the seminar, once we close things out. Our next Florida Virtual School seminar will be on December 14th, John Brown, Hero or Villain, and that will be led by Fitzhugh Brundage, professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a National Humanities Center Fellow. So, ladies and gentlemen, please remember to submit your evaluations and do your primary document application forms. I want to thank you very much for your intelligent participation, and I want to thank Matt for giving us a really interesting seminar. I mean, this is the second or third seminar we've done on Lincoln. I'm by no means a Lincoln expert, but I heard things here today that I'd never heard before. It was really fascinating and interesting. Matt, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, to wrap things up now, all you need to do is exit, and you know how to do that. You go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen, click on the word File. There'll be a drop-down menu. The last item is Leave the Session. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again on December 14th.